Okay.
All right, so we're going to get started. We have very lucky and thrilled to have our guest speaker, Margaret Price. She's an associate professor of English at Stony College, where she teaches rhetoric, composition, and creative nonfiction. Her areas of specialization include disability studies, qualitative research methodologies, and digital accessibility. Dr. Price's book, Mad at School, The Rhetorics of Mental Disability and Academic Life, won the Outstanding Book Award from the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Okay, and now who we have here in the class, as far as I can see, are the occupational therapy students who are taking the disability studies and occupational therapy class. They're going to be graduating with their degrees in June.
Congratulations.
They completed all their field work. We have our doctoral faculty and students. We have guests from New York City, Disability Studies colleagues from New York City, and we have the Center for Inclusive Education faculty up there. And we have Patty Gunn and her husband.
I'm Ken Lindblom. Comp Red is in the house. I'm Ken Lindblom.
And Patty has a book coming out too. What's it? Let me plug your book first.
Yes.
It's called Disabling Characters.
Disabling Characters.
Representations of Disability in Young Adult Literature.
Representations of Disability in Young Adult Literature by Patricia Dunn.
And it came out last week.
All right. Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you all so much for having me here today. It's really exciting to be at a place with so much action taking place around disability studies and around disability activism. And I've only been talking to people for about 2 hours at this point, and I'm already really excited and have some new things to read. So it's just been wonderful so far. I'm also really looking forward to the discussion that we all have after today's talk. So I want to really encourage people to think of questions, think of comments they might want to make, follow-ups that might be useful. One of the most fun things for me about doing a visit is not really delivering my own thoughts, because I sort of know what they are, but learning what directions people take them in. So I'm really excited about that part of this. The image on the cover slide that's up on the screen right now shows a cluster of people sitting in orange gold conference room chairs, all facing to the right of the photo frame. One audience member is typing on a laptop while looking up from the screen. Another is knitting. Another is peering into a mobile phone. In the background is a plain beige wall dotted with a telephone, an emergency exit chart, and a plate of switches for the room's fluorescent lights. The title of this talk, which is on the slide, is Transient Spaces and the Traces They Leave, Practicing Access in Higher Education. Before we get started today, I want to invite everyone to use this space in the way that's most accessible for you. This is an invocation that I've started giving every time I present, and of course, every time I present, I'm in a different kind of academic space. So the space we're in today is a large auditorium with kind of vivid purple walls that I'm sort of into. There are steps, risers leading down to where I am in the front of the room, and on each level of the risers is a curved table. It's nice to have a table when you're attending a talk because you have a place to spread out all your stuff. And the chairs are attached onto the tables, so your range of movement within a chair may be a little bit limited. So within the confines of the space that we're occupying together today, I want to invite everyone to use this space in the way that is most accessible for you. That is, to think about ways that the space might be accessible for you, including if and whether they're different from quote-unquote conventional behavior in academic spaces. So, for example, you might wish to sit on the floor or lie on the floor instead of remaining in a chair. You might want to move around during the talk. You might want to stim, flap, knit, do something else that enables you to pay attention in your own way. You might want to come out and come back in. You might want to engage with another person or engage with a screen that you have with you. All of these forms of engagement are welcome. So I just want to mention to folks that that is a welcome part of this talk, and that sort of persists throughout our time together, that I'm very interested in having the people that I'm talking with use spaces in ways that are accessible for them, and to think about adjusting the spaces as possible in ways that are accessible for them. Also, in terms of accessibility, Pam has kindly made copies of this talk. And Pam, can I ask you to kind of make those available to anyone who might signal? If you would like a copy to follow along with, please wave your hand or otherwise signal Pam. I see that's a very popular idea. I'm also happy to email this talk to anyone who wants a copy for their own records.
So who needs to follow along versus who will, yeah. So if you can, if a later one is okay. So who would like one now? Yeah. Anybody else would like one now? I have 4 more copies. And I have 1 large print copy.
While Pam is handing those out, I'm just going to put in a plug for a website that I'm working on. It's called composingaccess.net, and it came to mind. It's a website dedicated to information on accessible presenting. And the reason it came to mind is I have found that the appearance of copies at talks where the person is reading from a copy, a lot has to do with how the invitation to take the copies is made and how they are actually distributed. So lots of times presenters will bring their copies, but then they'll sort of be like, there's some copies up front, and then proceed to continue presenting. And very few people, especially in kind of a confining environment like this one, want to actually make the journey to the podium to get their copy. So one of the videos on composing access is dedicating to what does it look like when you provide copies at a talk. And there's also actually a video about what if you don't have copies, that is, you don't speak from a script. It's a good website. All right, so now I'm going to start the talk proper. Before I do, I want to do a quick check-in. How is the miking and the hearability for people? Use a wave or a thumbs up to tell me if that looks okay to you. And lighting. Anyone want to signal or make a suggestion about different light? More than 10 years ago, I was invited to spend 2 weeks at a prestigious university engaging with other scholars in various areas of critical theory, including disability studies. I was thrilled. I couldn't wait to be among like-minded academics and activists. However, the experience was not the 2-week festival of access and intellectual comradeship that I had naively imagined. We were given a heavy reading load ahead of time, and we had just weeks to prepare. Once we got there, I discovered that the seminars were run in one small room, the typical seminar room with people around a table, and we were in there together for hours each day. The only break during the day was lunch, which we were expected to eat together. Conversation during the seminar was conventionally styled. That is, participants were expected to break into the conversation on their own initiative and to follow complex and intersecting trains of thought without engaging any modes beyond the oral. Now, when I describe the seminar this way, I don't mean to say that it was unusually diabolical in its setup. In fact, what I want to point out about this story is that the design of that seminar was completely ordinary. I was surrounded by others who seemed to be taking it all in stride. The hours sitting in one small room, the unscripted turn-taking, the many social events. And I just kept asking myself, why can't I do this? At the time, I was too afraid to articulate that question publicly, since I was pretty sure that the failing must be in me. Experiences like that one have left deep traces on me, and they have a lot to do with why I study what I do. My research focuses on the design of spaces where body-minds come together. And I'm going to go off script for a moment and mention that when I say body-mind, I mean to indicate the two entities that are usually referred to as the body and the mind. Feminist scholarship and philosophy have done a lot to create a notion of a body-mind. And I got the term body-mind from trauma theory, specifically the work of Babette Rothschild. I'm back on the script. In Mad at School, that book, I introduced a concept that I called chirotic space. And this draws from the classical Greek concept of kairos, which is usually translated to mean the opportune time or simply good timing. Chirotic space requires not only good design, usually arranged ahead of time, but also good timing in the moment. These are the less formal and often unnoticed areas of academe where knowledge is produced and power is exchanged. A classroom discussion is a chirotic space, as is an individual meeting with one's advisor. Conferences are rife with chirotic spaces, including the Q&A sessions after panels, impromptu elevator encounters, and gatherings at restaurants and bars on the periphery of the formal conference events. Other examples from students' experiences might include peer response workshops, study groups, or departmental parties or gatherings to which they are invited. When I first wrote about chirotic space, I defined it in terms of 5 criteria. The 5 criteria that are indicated in Mad at School are slightly different from the ones on this slide. For example, when I wrote Mad at School, I was assuming that people had to be present in space physically together, which I've now realized, of course, is kind of silly. So these are the criteria for me at this time as to what characterizes chirotic space. First, the events in chirotic space are synchronous. They unfold in what we typically call real time. Second, impromptu communication in chirotic space is required or at least strongly encouraged. Participants are telepresent. They may be present in person, or they may be present through a digital interface, such as a video chat, or they may be present in hybrid form. For example, if someone is attending a discussion or lecture and simultaneously tweeting, they would be telepresent in a more hybrid form. Fourth, a chirotic space is a situation that involves a strong social element. And fifth, stakes are high. Now, when I describe chirotic space, I'm not doing it in a particularly systematic way. So, for example, when I talk about chirotic space, I will say that it involves all or most of these criteria. And I say that to indicate, I'm now on the bottom of page 2, to indicate that the boundaries of such spaces are neither rigid nor objectively determined. So, for instance, a meeting taking place either in person or via instant message between a graduate student and their assigned academic mentor would probably qualify as a chirotic space. But an informal study session between 2 students who've been friends for years, occupy a relatively horizontal power relationship, and who would experience minimal risk in studying together, that probably would not qualify as a chirotic space. The defining element of chirotic space for me is the pairing of spontaneity with high levels of professional academic impact. And it's also critical to note that different people in chirotic space will perceive its level of impact differently. So, for example, while an advisor may think, oh, I'm going to take my advisee out for lunch, that would be so nice for them, what a treat. The advisee may simultaneously experience that space as very stressful. I don't claim the ability to define what is and is not a chirotic space if I am not directly involved. And in fact, that's part of my point, that a person in one space may feel that it's entirely low stakes and friendly, while another may perceive a significant sense of risk. I'm now in the middle of page 3 in the first full paragraph. Despite their importance, chirotic spaces in academia tend to be understudied. One reason for that is that because they are unscripted, it's difficult to collect data there. Another more compelling reason is that their impact tends to be underestimated by those who move through them with ease. That is, before I wrote Mad at School, one of the consistent frustrations I experienced was people just seemed so casual about these kinds of spaces, and they seemed to have this sense that they were invariably pleasant and that it was easy to go or not go, and it was easy to function in them Whereas I perceive these kinds of spaces, for example, having a drink after sessions at a conference, I perceive them as very difficult to navigate. And so I felt like, why isn't there more attention to this? Why do most people think this is easy? The importance of a chirotic space will be more obvious to a person who, for example, can hear only scraps of a conversation held among a group sitting at a table, or a person who needs more than a few seconds to process a question that's asked of them during a classroom discussion. So using this notion of chirotic space, in Mat at School, I explored a variety of topoi, which is typically translated as common topics, in academia. Topoi are ideas that are commonly referred to among a particular community, but whose definitions tend to be fuzzy. This fuzziness often ends up working to the advantage of those who already have more power in the situation. In Sharon Crowley's phrasing, such concepts, quote, are part of the discursive machinery that hides the flow of difference, end quote. So a common topic in the US is the notion of freedom. It gets referred to a lot. It's very much a shared topic, but its definition tends to be changed based on the power dynamics of different situations. While I was doing the discourse analysis that comprises sort of the meat of Mat at School, I identified a number of topoi that are important in academic space, but which I think also are underexamined with regard to disability. These topoi include rationality, criticality, presence, participation, resistance, productivity, collegiality, there's a lot, security, coherence, truth, and independence. And there's a few more coming in just a minute. In my most recent research, which includes a study of disability disclosure being carried out in collaboration with Stephanie Kirschbaum, Mark Salzer, and Amber O'Shea, we've found some additional topics, topoi, that bear further examination. And these include costs and gains, flexibility, and space/time. Now, of course, this represents a huge array of possibilities for thinking, unpacking, and following up ideas. So just to be clear, I am not undertaking this whole unpacking project today. Instead, I'm going to zoom in and talk about just one of these, which I've been thinking a lot about lately, space, and its seemingly inevitable companion, time. The question that's been spurring my investigation into space-time is this: how do social justice and injustice play out in the spaces of academe? And how can we stop perpetuating injustice in the spaces we design and inhabit? If you're looking at the script, I'm now on the last paragraph on page 4. Now, when I say space, I don't just mean a measurable or nameable space, like this auditorium that we're in right now. My understanding of space draws from cultural geography, including those who have focused on disability, including Brendan Gleeson and Joss Boys. Space, in a cultural geographer's conception, doesn't just mean the sort of container where things take place. It also means the discourses, practices, and histories that infuse that space. We might even say that haunt it. Such an understanding of space draws upon Edward Socia, who came up with a notion called the Socio-spatial dialectic in his book, Postmodern Geographies. This dialectic posits that, or the concept of this dialectic posits that space and sociality are interdependent. That is, the way a space is designed does not determine what social relations will unfold within it, nor do the social relations of a space determine its shape. Both of those things, the space and the sociality, are constantly producing each other all the time. And further, according to Socia and other cultural geographers, the constant co-production of space and sociality cannot be separated from the relations of power that are entwined with that space. So to quote from Socia, a statement that sort of sums up that notion of the socio-spatial dialectic, the spatiality and temporality of locales are contextually intertwined and inseparably connected to relations of power from outset to outcome. That's very abstract, so I want to offer a concrete example that illustrates how this process may unfold in a specific moment. The image that I've just put on the slide shows a photograph that looks into the elevator of the Spelman College bookstore. The inside of the elevator is being used for storage of boxes of books. To the left of the elevator's entrance is a large vending machine and a sign reading, somewhat ironically, "Line starts here." To the right is a display of bottled water. The passageway into the elevator is very narrow. And this photo was taken by Britt Robinson and Amber Hobbs, who were in my disability studies class and completing an assignment that I had asked the class to do, in which they audited specific parts of the campus for accessibility. Now, if we thought of this elevator only in terms of its literal design, we would think of it simply as a mechanical box that transports occupants from one level to another. As the series of photographs by Britt and Amber show, they actually took a series of photos, and this is just one of them. As the series of photographs that they took shows, this elevator is in fact operational. Its doors work, it does ascend and descend between levels, and so forth. However, its purpose has been mediated by the addition of the many cardboard boxes inside, which, as the student's report indicates, are very heavy. As it turns out, they're actually filled with books. So now this space has been repurposed by the inhabitants of the Spelman bookstore as a storage space. And although no people are present in this photo, we can discern traces of the people who are assumed to be the users of this space. Note that there is a small cleared area in the front of the boxes. In other words, this elevator is still in use as a mode of transportation up and down. The space that has been cleared looks to be about adequate for a single adult person standing up, maybe two if they squinch together. It is not large enough for any but the slimmest wheelchairs, and certainly there is not space for a wheelchair to turn around and for the user to access the elevator's button panel. Moreover, there's not space for an adult who is not of a particular size. That is, this is not a generous space. It does not imagine a larger person. So this space is constructed not only through metal and carpet and drywall, but also through assumptions, the imagining of who this elevator is for. And the socio-spatial dynamic is continuing through the process of my students' audit, since during their audit, they asked an employee why the elevator had been turned into a storage closet. The employee explained that, quote unquote, no one used this elevator except to transport books. Note that the dialectic outlined by Soja is constructed not only through what is there, but also through the possible futures implied by what's there. Presumably, if a wheelchair user, a large person, someone who is unable to tolerate confined spaces, or anyone else not able to occupy this very cramped space, saw the interior of this elevator, they would indeed quickly become a non-user of it, and thus part of no one. So that understanding of space as something that both produces but is also produced by social relations, including disability, that understanding emphasizes something that disability studies scholars have been arguing for a long time, which is that accommodations, while necessary and important, are really only a beginning point. Accommodations, by their nature, identify a single person or a small group who has some, quote-unquote, problem, a problem that needs to be fixed. For example, let's imagine a student named Robert who has ADHD and needs detailed notes for a lecture class he's taking, but he is unable to take notes at the pace the lectures usually proceed. An accommodation approach to this issue might be to assign a note taker for Robert. Usually that would be another student, often paid a small stipend, who takes notes during lecture and then gives Robert a copy of those notes. Note that this accommodation does not do anything to change the structure within which the problem exists. The style of the lecture class is not altered, nor is the pace of the lecture, nor is the assumption that each student should have their own personal set of notes, which is distinct from the notes of every other person in the class. Assigning a note taker for Robert is a retrofit. That is, it leaves the general structure intact while adding on some modification. Often these added modifications are awkward. Retrofits both in physical design and in educational design tend to stand out. They tend to look added on specifically because they are. Melanie Yergo and Jay Dolmage are among the scholars who have identified the link between accommodation and retrofitting. Indeed, as Yergo says, to accommodate is to retrofit. So according to Melanie Yergo at least, accommodations are not just something that is likely to involve retrofitting. Accommodation itself is tantamount to retrofitting. You can't have an accommodation, again, here I'm paraphrasing Melanie, you cannot have an accommodation unless you have already identified a problem. And therefore, an accommodation by its nature is a retrofit. That's Melanie's argument. By contrast, disability studies scholars, including Rob Michalko, have argued for an emphasis on access or accessible design, which seeks to transform spaces or situations rather than fix individuals' problems. Now, I do need to add an important caveat, which is that pretty much every disability studies scholar I know is still in favor of accommodations. I don't know anybody who's like, well, let's get rid of those. We need them. They are everyday solutions to material problems of inequity and lack of access. At the same time that we are using accommodations, I use accommodations myself in my professional life, we also, though, want to question them critically and ask, what is the, I guess you would say, ontological nature of an accommodation, and how might we move from this individualistic model into a larger, more socio-spatial model of access? My current research project, a study of disabled faculty and their experiences of disclosure, provides further evidence that an accommodation model falls far short in the effort to create a truly accessible and just academic environment. This study, which we began in 2012, is being conducted in two phases. First, an anonymous survey of faculty with mental disability, co-researched with Mark Salzer, Stephanie Kirschbaum, and Amber O'Shea. And second, a series of in-depth interviews, which I'm doing with Stephanie Kirschbaum. So in the next part of this talk, I want to offer a few preliminary thoughts drawn from that study. It's still ongoing, but it has already revealed important insights about the experiences of disabled faculty in higher education. I'll also say as an aside here that by studying faculty, we don't at all mean to imply that the situation of disabled students, including graduate students, is not important. The reason we're studying disabled faculty is there's been little work in that area, and faculty occupy a distinct position that in some ways is different from the position occupied by students. But obviously, study of students and graduate students is also needed, and the workshop that I'm doing tomorrow, in fact, focuses more on disability access, mental disability, and student populations in academia. If you're on script, I'm near the top of page 7 in the first full paragraph. So first, and this is a premise that we went into the study with, disclosure of disability is not a straightforward or one-time event. Disability studies scholars have been arguing this for quite some time, and our study, both the survey and the interview phases, have offered substantiation of that point, which previously had been substantiated mostly through first-person accounts or very small case studies. Disability disclosure is not often an easily identified event in which person A says to person B, for example, I have mental illness or I am deaf. So references to the closet being out or having an invisible disability are useful to some extent, but they run the risk of misrepresenting an experience with many more dimensions than in, out, or visible, invisible. And as this theory of disclosure suggests, our theory of disability disclosure has much in common with critical race theories and queer theories that also have looked at phenomena such as passing, covering, and disclosure. In the survey that began this study, we found that a large percentage, about 87% of responding faculty, had never requested accommodations for their mental disabilities. The survey then asked this group that had never requested accommodations why not, and participants were able to select more than one option if they wished for this item. The most common response was, "I do not need them." That was about 50%, followed by, "was not aware they were available," about 34%. "Feeling that it's not other people's business," 31%, and two categories selecting potential outcomes, possibility that the request would affect tenure promotion, about 25%, and possibility that people might avoid me or treat me badly, about 22%, were the next most commonly selected responses. Interestingly, no respondent selected the option, "cannot acquire necessary documentation." It should be noted that this was a subgroup of survey responses. This is only the group of people who responded, "I have never requested accommodations." And as the percentages here show, they add up to more than 100. Participants could select more than one response for this question. That same question, "why didn't you request accommodations?" left space for open-ended responses, and these open-ended responses ranged widely. Some respondents stated that they feel mental health is simply a personal issue. Some elaborated on their fear of negative outcomes. Some stated that they simply felt they didn't need accommodations, or that accommodations already given to everyone in the office, for example, relatively flexible scheduling, already met their needs. Fear of stigma is a significant theme that runs throughout many of the open-ended responses. One participant wrote succinctly, one word, "stigma," with stigma in all caps. Another participant wrote, "fear of losing all credibility," with fear in all caps. And yet another elaborated more fully on this concern, which in this case stems from having seen another colleague face negative consequences. This third person wrote, "I do not think that the risk of serious reprisal is high, but I have seen a colleague with a serious mental health issue subjected to constant gossip originating with administrators, and I believe such would seriously damage my ability to work." I'm going to go off script for just a moment and mention something that has just emerged in our interview data, like in the last 2 weeks, which is why it's not in this talk. Stephanie and I have been interviewing faculty with a wide range of disabilities, not just mental disability, but some of our interview sample also includes faculty with mental disability. And one of the things that we seem to be finding among our participants with mental disability is that it can be very hard to imagine the accommodations that might be useful. So, for example, one person that we interviewed said essentially, "I don't know, what could they do about depression? You know, like, I'm depressed, I can't get into the classroom. Aside from the accommodation magical substitute who emerges at an hour's notice, I don't know how I would articulate that accommodation. Like, what would that even look like?" I'm paraphrasing our participant there, not quoting her directly. And this is a really interesting thing that seems to be emerging not only among the mentally disabled participants in the interviews, but among various disabled faculty who are simply not in the imagination of the university. If you are not imagined as a person who might need accommodation, it can be difficult to even think what those accommodations might be. I'm back on script at the first full paragraph on page 8. As I mentioned, the interview study sampled not just faculty with mental disability, but faculty with a wide range of disability. This includes blindness, deafness, both signing and non-signing, multiple sclerosis, autism, bipolar disorder, ADD, depression, mobility impairments, and chronic illnesses or pain. And those are all self-identified by our participants. We're only in the beginning stages of data analysis, and we're still conducting interviews. But in a preliminary way, we have already found that many of the concerns raised by mentally disabled faculty on the survey are echoed in interviews by faculty with other kinds of disabilities. One emergent theme that we've identified is a strong sense of vulnerability that many faculty have described. For example, one respondent who has a chronic illness that affects both mobility and stamina stated that, You don't know who's going to play that card, that is, you're having disclosed your disability, against you for any reason without you even knowing it's happening. Another respondent who is blind explained that she is, quote unquote, very careful when responding to questions about how she manages her classroom. For example, how she ensures that students are staying on task, although she is not monitoring them visually. She explained that disclosing this information could make her vulnerable, and used that word specifically. For example, it could be suggested that she is not able to manage her classroom adequately. A third participant described taking great care in choosing which diagnoses she discloses when discussing accommodations with her school's ADA coordinator. Having diagnoses of both attention deficit and bipolar disorder, this faculty member perceived that disclosing ADD put her at relatively lower risk, and the information about her mood disorder should be kept, as she put it, quote, a little more close to the chest, end quote. This same faculty member seems to have a sharp sense of what accommodation requests are permissible and which might be, as she put it, quote, treading too close to the line, end quote. Requests like a modification of her workload, for example, she thought might put her at some risk even to suggest. And bear in mind that she wouldn't even be suggesting this to her direct supervisor. She would be suggesting it to her school's ADA coordinator, who ostensibly has no direct supervisory role over her. I'm going to go off script again just for a moment and mention that that issue of disclosing one disability but not another, with the more hidden disability being perceived by the participant to be the higher risk disability, was also something found by Tara Wood. She recently completed a dissertation about students' use of accommodations in the undergraduate classroom, and she calls this phenomenon selective disclosure. And I just learned about that at a recent conference. But it was really interesting to me that her finding was the same as ours. Namely, if someone has more than one diagnosis, in order to obtain accommodations, they may choose to disclose one diagnosis but not the other. I'm now on the top of page 9. Faculty members' intersectional identities, including race, gender, class, rank, institutional type, and other factors, affected their experience of vulnerability, as they do all the other emergent themes in this study. For example, one interviewee who is in a non-permanent, non-tenure track position stated although her job is, quote, relatively secure, quote, I don't know how comfortable I would be asking for accommodations given the yearly contract issue, end quote. Elsewhere in the interview, she elaborated on the deep divisions and sometimes wounding treatment that occurs as a result of differences between faculty members' ranks. So in addition to vulnerability, another emergent theme that we're looking at is the issue of disabled faculty members choosing to use their own personal resources for accommodation, rather than choosing to go through the official channels at their colleges or universities. Our survey showed that a large percentage, about half, of mentally disabled faculty who responded did not even know what office they should approach at their university to request accommodations if they did wish to do so. This lack of a clear infrastructure might be part of what causes disabled faculty to avoid requesting accommodations officially. Another reason might be that it's simply less trouble to carry out accommodations themselves. One faculty member who requires frequent rest, for example, has equipped their office with a sleeping mat, pillow, and noise-canceling headphones, which were purchased with personal funds and are kept in a large file drawer when not in use. Another faculty member diagnosed with ADD described wanting to ask for a coach to help her manage her time and tasks, but thought that request might be, quote-unquote, pushing it, and chose to work on time management with her own personal therapist instead. A third interviewee, who is blind, explained that when navigating professional conferences, she often travels with her husband so he can aid her in wayfinding. She noted that she chooses this option because it requires, as she put it, less explanation than trying to arrange accommodations for wayfinding through the professional society whose conference it is. Now, again, I should emphasize that these findings are very preliminary. This is really more stuff we've been thinking about than systematically arrived at codes or themes. Also, our sample does not represent a randomized sample of disabled faculty. And in fact, what we've been using is a method called maximum variation purposive sampling, also sometimes called diversity sampling, which essentially means that you're deliberately going for the widest range of experiences and locations possible in an effort to raise questions and begin discussions rather than to say anything definitive about the population of disabled faculty. I'm at the top of page 10 now. I don't mean to suggest clear lines of causation or fault by presenting these short anecdotes. My experience in working in disability studies in academia has shown that it's really not usually that useful or that accurate to say it's this office's fault or it's that office's fault or all chairs are mean or all administrators are evil or faculty are always fighting with each other or students are lazy or any of these tropes that are so easy to fall back on. The picture is just not that simple. What I want to offer these anecdotes for is for their suggestive potential. They offer us the opportunity to ask important questions. This is one of the most important questions I think that the study has led me to so far. If the year is 2015 and the Americans with Disabilities Act is 25 years old this year, and if we in higher education believe in the principles of equal access and justice, why are disabled faculty still so dramatically underrepresented in the professoriate? And further, this second question, I think, is the one that the interview study has really called my attention to. Further, why do those already working as faculty have such a strong sense that their position is so vulnerable, that they are, to borrow a phrase from Tanya Tichkowski, barely in? I'm going to go off script again for just a moment and mention that Stephanie and I, have heard story after story after story about the ways that disabled faculty enact this sense of being barely in, not asking for things, asking for this thing but not that thing, dealing with it themselves, calling on spouses or personal networks to help them access their professional resources, behaving in certain ways. It just goes on and on and on. It's not that anyone tells us as disabled people this is how you're supposed to act. It's the atmosphere. And you just begin to act in particular ways, to self-govern in particular ways, because the sense of being barely in is so strong, and the sense of the precarity of your position is so strong. And I'm incredibly grateful to the people in our interview study for sharing these stories. And honestly, I feel pretty humbled and overwhelmed at the attempt to bring together all these specific pieces of data and get them to coalesce in that big finding, which is disabled faculty are self-governing so furiously because this sense of barely in is not coming from any single place. It's atmospheric. The project of accessibility, if you're on script, I'm in the last paragraph on page 10. The project of accessibility in higher education means more than just ensuring everyone has the proverbial seat at the table. It means rethinking what that table itself means. What structures are we working within? And how do our own actions and attitudes help shape those structures, even as we sometimes strain against them? What does the work of justice look like? And in what sorts of spaces is it pursued? I don't have a design for disability justice or disability access in academia. What I do have is assurance that these goals, the goal of disability and social change itself, are worked toward in situations that emerge through the interactions of humans, animals, spaces, structures, and policies. This is all our work. Thank you. Okay, I'm happy to take any questions or comments that people might want to share.
I have a microphone, so raise your hand and I will.
Oh, right, we have a traveling mic.
Yeah, my students are used to it. They like watching me run around. This is actually easier in this space than the lecture hall one. But we don't have the piano. Lecture hall one, they have a piano. Yeah.
And they plays along.
The potential is there. I feel it in the air. Okay. And then 1, 2. Did you have a question too? No. 1, 2, 3. I don't know what it's on.
I love the picture of the elevator with the boxes because I think it shows in a very concrete way when you stop and describe it. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I would just go by. I would just, that's a little messy. It looks like my office at home or something. But I wouldn't analyze it in the way that you have. And it's kind of a metaphor for how a lot of academic space in the world is. And that's like it's visual evidence of it, but it's also a metaphor for the larger atmosphere that you're talking about. So I love that.
Since Patty has mentioned the elevator, I'll just also say that this notion of spaces serving as metaphors keeps infusing my thinking. Another thing that Stephanie and I have found, actually we found this both in the survey and the interview, is that very frequently faculty will use complicated workarounds to achieve the access that they need. So one of the things that we're receiving is stories about how access is actually achieved, and the stories often take the form of, well, I figured out that if I ask so-and-so to do such and such at 8 o'clock on Wednesday mornings, then I can get into the such and such, and then I can make this work. And there's this really convoluted system that the individual faculty member has figured out. And Stephanie was calling those initially pathways to access. And I was thinking, I want to call them something else, because a pathway to me sounds like something that's been created for access, like something you can walk along or roll along. And I started to think about what are called desire paths in architecture. They're very common on college campuses. You have your paved sidewalks, which is where people are quote-unquote supposed to walk. And then you also have those pounded down pathways between the sidewalks where people actually walk. There is a term for that. They're called paths of desire or desire paths. And I started thinking lots of times the way we access spaces is by desire paths. Not the paths we're quote-unquote supposed to follow, which are supposedly so straight and well-planned and nicely laid out, but actually through this other way that's kind of messier and more spontaneous and more collaborative, but also for various reasons, some of which have to do with power and privilege, end up working better.
Hi. Did you find in your data or research anybody who did risk, I guess, that vulnerability and asked for accommodations and then regretted it because those accommodations weren't met, or they kept on having to prompt in order to get those accommodations met?
Yes, we have actually talked to a number of people who have asked for accommodations and then had it go one of any number of ways that are not very desirable. One person, for example, discusses accommodations every year with the people she's supposed to go to with this, which is her chair and an administrator. This particular school happens not to have a disability service office that serves faculty. And even though her accommodations are officially instituted, she literally has to re-raise them every single time a meeting is scheduled, or every time she's assigned a classroom. She just has to do it over and over again. And that iterative experience, so far we're finding, does not seem to relate very strongly to what kind of disability you have. Your disability could be very, quote-unquote, visible, but you're still reminding people all day long, like, there's a stair there. Or your disability might be quite, quote-unquote, invisible, and you're still reminding people all day long. Can't do that, or that's not going to work for me. We have also, I'm sorry to say, experienced some participants who've really had an experience of really unpleasant pushback. And in one case, an interview that I just did recently, a faculty member who was essentially publicly humiliated in a large meeting that she was present at and some of her students were present at and administrators were present at, and a quote-unquote problem was being discussed openly. And that wasn't open pushback in the form of, I'm going to violate the law and you can't have an accommodation. Like, that rarely happens because universities realize that's illegal. The pushback tends to come in forms that just make it incredibly unattractive to advocate for one's own needs. It's not a very pleasant picture, I'm afraid.
How did you come up with the common topics, the Topoi?
The ones like productivity and I would like to say my method was fabulously systematic. Everyone who's currently in a methods class, I was very systematic. I actually wasn't that systematic. The discourse analysis that I did involved reading public documents in that govern academic spaces. So, for example, accessibility policies for conferences, published accounts around school shootings were another type of document I looked at, memos. I didn't look at letters of recommendation, but my colleague Amy Vidali has actually done a very interesting study of those. And I essentially wrote down Topoi as they came to me. It was not a systematic process of the kind that Stephanie and I are using for our interviews. We're doing that much more along stricter grounded theory lines, and we're using what's called a constant comparative method, which means that we go through a chunk of data like an interview. We each go through it independently. We come up with what we think might be important categories or codes. We compare those. We add more data. We compare again. So for the interviews that we're doing now, it's more systematic. To be completely honest, when I wrote Mad at School, I was writing it fast. My tenure review was coming up. I was also very angry and impassioned at the time. I'm not recommending any of this. But I honestly just read a bunch of stuff and was like, these seem really important. So that is a straight-up, honest answer.
Can you talk a little bit more about like the data gathering process? Because I would think that a lot of people, if you're trying to hide your disability, may not want to share information with you. And did you have any sort of resistance to sharing because people are afraid that your data may not be 100% anonymous or something like that?
The issue of anonymity and confidentiality for the faculty study has been a guiding principle throughout, an actual shaping principle. I first conceived of this study as an interview study. I am not a quantitative researcher, which I was talking to Celeste and Cassandra about. I really wasn't equipped to do a large-scale survey, and so I thought I'll do an interview study. This will be very interesting. And then I realized I wanted to do an interview study of mentally disabled faculty currently working in academia, ideally in a sample that went beyond my own personal friends. I had no way of finding these faculty. I was actually talking to a grant reviewer who said, how are you going to find your sample? And I was like, I don't know. So I eventually decided I would do a survey. So it all turned out to be actually really fortuitous. I realized I needed to do a completely anonymous study of some kind and gather volunteers. I spent a survey, and that meant doing something more seriously quantitative than I had done before. At that point, I contacted Mark Salzer, who's my research partner at Temple University, who does really smart, just really thoughtful statistical analyses of mentally disabled students in higher education, and specifically how they use accommodations, and just kind of said, do you want to try to do this together? And he's very nice and very generous and said yes. So we started with the anonymous survey, and we went to tremendous lengths to make sure that it's truly anonymous in the sense that we have no way of knowing who the participants are. Once the survey is filled out and comes to us, we have no capability of attaching those data to any particular person. If anyone from that survey wanted to volunteer for the interview study, they went to a separate space to do their volunteering, and that's how we contacted them. Now, for the interviews, we do know who our volunteers are, and we have a database of volunteers with identifying information. Obviously, we guard this information very, very carefully, and everything is locked, password protected, only we have access to it, etc. But confidentiality, of course, really goes further than that. Some of the faculty that we're talking to are very identifiable. For example, I teach at a historically black college for women. Well, there are only 2 of those in the country. So if you say very much about me demographically as a professor, you have identified me. And many of our participants are in that position. They are relatively unique in their discipline or relatively unique at their school, or their school itself is relatively unique. And for some of our participants, we are in active dialogue about what confidentiality is going to look like. Now, that's in some ways quite frustrating because it is intersectionally important sometimes that a person is, their first language is ASL. Or it's intersectionally important that they teach at a historically black college. Or, like these so-called demographic characteristics are part of their location as a faculty member, and to take those out when describing them really strips out important contextual information. However, our choice is always to be completely safe and to gravitate to exactly how the faculty member wants to be represented. We have not done a lot of formal presentation of data yet, but every time we do, we go back to the people represented and say, does this look okay? And we have to do it that labor-intensive way specifically because the information is it makes people very vulnerable.
Thank you. I thought it was really interesting how you said a few minutes ago or a few questions ago that there was one faculty member who, I'm not sure if it was the faculty member or you, who said that that faculty member had established an elaborate workaround.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's a very interesting concept because usually when people talk about workaround or when they talk about hacking or things like that, it's usually very positive, And you painted a very strong picture of vulnerability and precarity. And I guess I'm wondering, first of all, if you have encountered faculty who do talk about the things that they do, in positive language, or talk about, their workaround sort of positively. That's first of all. And then second of all, it's also interesting to think about this language of the workaround in relation to the hack, right? Because remember how I'm very against this idea of like hacking space or hacking the environment because it does often represent like an individual fix, right? And so I guess the question is like, how do we think about that more broadly, especially in this context, right? So if you have the individual faculty member who is creating, the hack or the workaround, how does that then reflect on this broader question of vulnerability and precarity?
That is a great question. I was talking about workarounds mostly in the sense that a programmer would call kludgy. A kludgy workaround is one that's kind of crappy and awkward and it's more retrofitty. Whereas Michelle's absolutely right. A workaround can also be a hack. It can be a graceful, a clever, even a subversive way to transform a system. And that's something that I think is really, the word hack is very, very right now. Or at least, I'm 45. It's right now in my mind. But, you hear this all the time, like, let's hack this system, or let's hack this classroom, or let's hack everything. And hacking means a lot of different things. It can mean a lot of different things. I think the positive nature of hack is a hack, in the positive sense, subverts and transforms the system it's hacking. It doesn't merely figure out a mode of survival within that system. It effects some kind of change. And there are faculty members who've responded in that way. For example, one faculty member has essentially designed an entire job description around their specific disability and their specific way of being in the world. This particular faculty member is not on the tenure track and every year renegotiates their contract. And every year they essentially say to the people they're negotiating the contract with, this is what I think I can do. And the contract is written that way, and the job has sort of bloomed into this really interesting, really effective, disability-centered kind of job. And I'm being very vague about this because this is one of the people who, if I described their job more specifically, I would almost be describing them. it's that individual. It's that specific to the environment, as a good hack is. I'm wary of the metaphor of hacking, in part because it does tend to be used in this sort of very hacking is so cool, everything is great, like celebrational context, but also because, at least so far, a lot of the workarounds that I've been seeing in the interview study, I'm kind of going back through them in my mind as I speak, a lot of them really have to do, it feels more with survival than with, oh, it's so cool, I can really work this system now. Certainly we've talked to a number of people who are very happy in their situations and doing well and really have things figured out. But it almost, at least to me, feels more like I figured out how to do my taxes. Or, I figured out how to manage this, as opposed to this really is so exciting. At the same time, there is something specific that comes out of the constant need to self-accommodate and to figure out these desire paths, which is a lot of the faculty members we've talked to, some are actively in crisis, actively struggling. But those who aren't, a lot of them have incredibly rich networks. Now, that has a downside, too. If you don't have access to such a network, of course, you probably are in big trouble as a disabled faculty member. You lack the extra resources the system forces you to need. But the people who are thriving seem to be turning to a really rich network of people and to an interdependent way of doing their jobs that can be very fulfilling. I can't say I'm talking about a lot of our sample when I say that, though. We also do talk to a lot of people who are just like, all right, I've got to figure it out for this year, but God knows what's going to happen when I don't have that course release next year or whatever. I think it's valuable to think about this in terms of subversion and hacking, though. That gives me more thoughts about the paths of desire.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about time in relation to space. And so one of the top accommodations for students, of course, is more time to do something. And that seems a completely reasonable accommodation, and disability services on our campus is wonderful about helping the professors make that accommodation by having a separate space for those students to take an exam that they need more time to take, so we don't have to proctor it. So that seems like a really kind of reasonable kind of time-space accommodation. And of course, that kind of accommodation is not afforded to faculty in most cases. Certainly the workspace in general, yeah. But I'm also thinking about sort of the tenure track idea,
right,
which is a temporal idea, really. So I wondered whether...
It's called the tenure clock.
Yeah, it's called the tenure clock, right. So I wondered about that, and then just one other sort of comment about desire paths. I mean, in architecture, those are, well, in my understanding, you seek those out before you put in the permanent path, before you pave. So you actually, there's a temporal aspect to that as well, where you would, let's see where people walk, right? Let's see where they want to go, and then we'll put a path there. But it seems like that, again, is we shortcut that. We don't take that time to allow, to find out where people want to go or how they want to go from one place to the other.
Or we don't let them move fence.
Right.
The paths of desire are fenced in the
Exactly.
school.
So I think those are both sort of temporal, kind of the relationship between time and space, and I wondered if you could say something about that. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I only relatively recently started referring to Crip space-time.
Yeah.
And I was giving a talk at another school, and I was sort of going on and on about space-time, and I said something like, so I'm not a physicist, so I don't really know if any of this is true. And then during the Q&A, a person raised their hand and said, well, I am a physicist. I was like, oh, God. And he said, no, you've got it pretty right. The baseline understanding of this is they are so deeply interdependent that they sort of conceptually, in a sense, can't be separated. I was like, time in academia is an incredibly interesting construct. It's already very obviously a theme in our interviews. And it's coming out in a wide variety of ways. A number of our interviewees have commented on the relentlessness of academic time. We're videotaping our interviews, and so we're analyzing gestures as well as what people say. And when people gesture, when they're talking about academic time, some of the gestures we've seen include like this or this. It seems to be this kind of inexorability that people talk about. And our interviewees have also pointed out not just the inexorable nature of time that we already, Stephanie and I, had been thinking about, for example, the tenure clock, or for PhD students, time to completion, your funding gets cut off at 5 years, those kinds of clocks. But some people who, for example, have chronic illnesses pointed out, once the semester starts, you are on the train. Like you can't just be like, wow, I really need a week off. I'm very fatigued. Like it's just not going to happen. So there are a number of different sort of clocks and things operating within academe that come up over and over again in interviews. At the same time, people comment positively on the flexibility of time that tends to attend faculty positions. It's paradoxical. At the same time that we are always operating, sort of like Charlie Chaplin, within these enormous clocks that we're subject to, the semester, the tenure clock, the time to completion clock, the deadlines. We also, as an interviewee just very recently pointed out to me, he said, there are relatively few hours a day that I actually have to have my body in any specific place as a professor. I have to have it in my classroom. He teaches face-to-face classes. And I have to have it there for my office hours. And sometimes I have to be at a meeting. And he said, but compared to someone who works, for example, a 9-to-5 job, the hours that I have to have my body in a specific place are actually relatively few. There's a certain flexibility as well. So one of our big interests, Stephanie's and mine, is not to tell a simple story about this. Not only to say that time is crushing and inflexible or that it's delightful and flexible, but that it really has this paradoxical role in the lives of people who work in academe. And in terms of the desire paths, my partner is an architect, which is one reason why I've gotten so interested in the notion of space and how I learn about stuff like desire paths. It has honestly been really eye-opening me to find out how architects actually design spaces. For example, when they can, and I come at this as a qualitative researcher, where everything is super in-depth and you're constantly going back to your participants and you're member checking. Like when architects are trying to find out how occupants use a building, there might be like one interview, and it will take place on one day, and like boom, they're out of there. And I'm not saying this is all architects. I'm probably offending all the architects in the audience and anyone who sees the video. It's not universally true among architecture, but like a lot of business, including academic business, when we say that we're getting feedback or instituting feedback loops, we're doing it in kind of a parachute in, parachute out kind of way. So I think that's one reason why desire paths tend to come up, is because somebody studied a campus for like 2 days and then left. But I'm not an architect, so I might just be slandering an entire profession without knowing it.
And Cassandra, and then.
Just had a quick question. So you talked about how a lot of times the faculty members, they have to advocate for themselves or have these networks. I guess, are there any, from your research, any universities that you came across, or maybe like model programs where that system is already in place to kind of facilitate, I guess that environment kind of facilitates everything, kind of like, I know Arizona State University is a big, like a great place for accessibility from the student perspective. I'm not sure from faculty perspective, though.
Arizona.
Yeah. I think it's one of those.
I think
it's Arizona State University. Whatever.
I think any place that expects people to be disabled tends to create a pretty usable environment. For example, the Ohio State University has an ADA coordinator who is a really strong disability advocate. He's very involved in disability studies. His name is Scott Lissner. And it's just very common, especially within certain departments at OSU, to talk about disability and access. It's very much in the culture. And other schools are like that too. In fact, I think Stony Brook is becoming one of those places just because Pam and other people have inspired a lot of discussion around disability, which inevitably, or I would hope inevitably, leads to also discussions about access and the environment that you're in. So I think it has a lot to do with culture. Syracuse is another place that comes to mind. The University of Michigan. Ironically, kind of a small Jesuit university that I visited in San Francisco, the University of San Francisco, seems to have a really active and joyful relationship between the Office of Disability Services, Disabled Students Organization, and faculty. And I think what causes these places to work is that there's an ongoing dialogue. It's not that one person arrives and everyone's like, oh, we never had to think about that before. It's that there's an expectation of disability. I will also add that it appears to be if a place doesn't have that kind of culture, you could get a very vocal disabled faculty member in there every 3 years, and they would consistently get the same reaction. We never thought about that before. No one's ever raised that before. One thing that I said in a recent talk I was giving is institutional forgetfulness can be as powerful as institutional memory. And it's so common as a disabled person to hear the sentence, no one's ever asked that before. Well, the fact is I think they probably have, but they have been forgotten. So places that don't forget those conversations, that have an ongoing dialogue, I think are the good places to be. Or easier anyway.
Hi. It's becoming apparent to me that how interesting that irony of the chirotic space you're talking to all these faculty about and what you mentioned in your book. So I'm wondering if it ever occurred to you that maybe asking some of those faculty you're interviewing, are they using that approach to teach their students but yet not allowing themselves to use it for their own work? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Oh, like are they using the recommendations for pedagogy?
Yeah, for students, but yet not advocating for themselves to use it in their work, needing extra time to gain tenure or publish or all these things.
Well, most faculty we've talked to, that we've interviewed, are not disability studies people and may or may not have engaged deeply with disability and access in their own pedagogy. Pretty much everyone I can think of is pretty savvy about the difference between students' situations and their own. And the fact is, it just is such a different ballgame for faculty, even though ostensibly faculty are protected under the same legislation, broadly speaking, that students are protected under. Because for a faculty member to even ask where is the office that I would go to discuss accommodation is tantamount to disclosing. And that's just a really different thing to do in front of your employer than in front of your professor. You know, not better, not worse, but just really different. I certainly have talked to a lot of professors who self-accommodate in very smart ways, find ways to gain extra time. I just talked to someone recently, for example, who works at a very specific pace because of chronic pain and was describing a great array, this kind of goes back to the hacking thing, a great array of things that they do to extend deadlines in a way that is sort of collegial and doesn't get people mad. I don't think I've talked to anyone who talks about it specifically in terms of MAD at school or the recommendations in there, but certainly people are pretty savvy about self-accommodating and doing what they need to do. There's a strong streak of practicality. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it was something that just occurred to me, not so much a question, but kind of a comment. And then the second thing I wanted to say is that you mentioned at lunch, I was privy to this, that you mentioned at lunch the idea of doors. And when you showed this picture, I keep thinking I want to bring it up to just have you mention to the crowd about doors.
Oh, yeah. So in the long version of this talk, it also included this long peroration about this other research project I'm doing, really almost just for fun. My friends Melanie Yergo and Elizabeth Brewer are editing a collection called Cripping the Computer, which is looking at the intersection of computers and composition, which is a subfield of composition and rhetoric, the intersection of that subfield and disability. And something that had come up in quite a few of Stephanie's and my interviews, we asked people specifically about their office spaces and their day-to-day routines. And something that had come up was the issue of the door. Whether people felt they could close their door or open their door, or whether their office had, they also talked about windows. These are sort of frequently mentioned features in faculty life in general. And they take on interesting resonance for disabled faculty. For example, if someone needs access to light, or if someone needs an office where the people coming in aren't always silhouetted, or various things. So I got really interested in the door, and I'm in the middle of this rhetorical study, not a qualitative study at all, just a rhetorical study of the door as topos, as common topic. So some of the things that I've been looking at are doors are really important in CRIP narratives, in CRIP stories. For example, lots of wheelchair users have an array of stories about how people react as they approach doors, like running ahead of them to open it, or balancing over them to super awkwardly hold the door open for the person in the wheelchair who's sort of like, I was about to get it. Like, I'm okay, I can open the door. And then there are other ways that doors may figure in disabled life. The classic sign, accessible entrance and back. You see that, of course, all the time. Another less commonly known but very frequent issue with doors is whether people in the room have a clear path to the door. This is an issue for people with various mental disabilities, whether they can see the door or get to the door easily. And if they're not able to do that, they may not be able to function in the space. I also, at the same time that I was thinking about physical doors in buildings and rooms, I got interested in the notion of the hyperlink as a door, as this kind of transient space that leads you from node to node and controls ingress and egress in specific ways. So I haven't really come up with any brilliant conclusions about doors, but I've just gotten more and more interested in moving through spaces and looking at how incredibly rhetorically loaded doors are. Some doorways that you see, particular restroom doors, will be just absolutely festooned with signifiers of gender and disability, and if you need a differently gendered or a differently accessible restroom, you go to this floor or that floor. And there's one great doorway in a building at the University of Michigan that not only has the markings that are like the person in pants and the person in the skirt and then the little person in the wheelchair next to them, but it also says, for no special reason, telephone over the top of the restroom door, because there's a telephone in there. And so I've been looking at these different doors, like where's the door opener? The one of the big takeaways I have so far is that these doors, just as academic spaces sort of dictate to us who we're supposed to be in this space, like these tables and these fixed chairs and these stairs, are saying things to the potential occupants of this room about who we're supposed to be. Doors, interestingly, seem to say something about who we're supposed to become as we go through that door. And right now I just have a whole bunch of examples.
Real quick.
Apologizing to his class.
Yeah.
Break.
Sorry. So have you kind of also found, because I'm glad you brought up the whole virtual door, how you spoke about marrying the spatial context to the temporal context, but what about the virtual context and how powerful it is in that relationship, and how that being there kind of outweighs the need for somebody working in academia to even risk that vulnerability or have you found that kind of theme where because we have this in place, I could be vulnerable, but I won't take the risk because I have this technological, assistive device or this virtual blackboard like we have here.
Right. Yes, absolutely. If I'm understanding it correctly, the question is basically how does the notion of virtual ingress and egress, virtual access, mediate what I've been talking about in terms of Right. Absolutely. Stephanie and I are working on an article about the ways that virtual and spatial access has infused our methodology. Stephanie's deaf. I have various mental disability diagnoses as well as a chronic illness. And one of the things that we found is the way we videotape our interviews is incredibly different. And actually tends to impede each other's access. So, for example, Stephanie frames her interviews really, really tightly because she needs to be able to see the faces of the interlocutors so that she can follow along in our transcription software, reading their lips as well as listening to the interview. The first few interviews that I framed on video, I was over here. My participant was over there, and the video camera was on that side of the room, and the whole thing, looked like a Quentin Tarantino, closing credits shot. Because I'm not comfortable sitting very close to people. I have a lot of issues with how safe my face is in proximity to other people. I really become incredibly fatigued by eye contact. Just reading faces alone is extremely fatiguing. So for all these reasons, like a lot of people with different kinds of mental disability, I tend not to get up in people's faces. And I don't want people up in mine. So one of the many, many things Stephanie and I had to negotiate was our virtual access to each other's taped interviews. Another thing that we're finding is that there's no such thing as an accessible interview environment. There's a strong bias in the literature toward preference for face-to-face interviews. This is commonly called, especially in the qualitative literature, the most authentic, the most engaging. It's routinely assumed that the interviewer who can be present is more effective than the interviewer in a video conference, all of which we think is pretty ableist. As well as, it's problematic for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is it's quite ableist to assume that a person is most strongly engaged in physical presence with other bodies. So we're writing about that as well. And in fact, if you email me, I can send you a copy of a paper I presented at SDS about this. Lastly, I want to just recommend the work of someone who is studying interviews in terms of accessibility and looking at the differences between, not qualitative interviews, but job interviews. She's looking at the difference between face-to-face, phone, and video modes for interviews, and doing interviews of people. She's doing qualitative interviews of people about their job interviews, and looking at the affordances and limitations of these different spaces. Her name is Caroline Dadas, D-A-D-A-S, and she had one article in College Composition and Communication about this, and she has a second one coming out in Cripping the Computer. This has been a little bit of a roundabout answer, and I should probably take a break because I'm getting increasingly rambly. But I have found over and over again, Stephanie and I have both found, that even though theoretically one could Skype into a space, for example, and it should be quote-unquote the same, it's not the same for the simple reason that nobody values it the same way. So whenever people try to treat different modes and platforms as neutral and comparable to each other, by dint of the fact that we understand them differently and we value them differently, they never are purely horizontal. Thank you. This is a good question.
Okay, so I wanted to ask one before we go on break. So we had 2 weeks ago Harolyn Russo come, and some of the doctoral students also read Irving Zola's Missing Pieces last semester, and both of them have this in common experience of what they both, well, Harolyn called it being in the closet, that she, you know, but it wasn't in the closet in the sense that nobody knew that she had a disability. It was more like she didn't recognize or see herself or want to be identified as disabled, and she did not ask for any accommodations. And Zola, in his life, Zola was also an academic, a sociologist, a polio survivor, and he used crutches. But he never asked for accommodations, you know, throughout most of his academic career. He would, you know, just kind of, muscle his way through, right? Muscle his way through. So I was wondering whether you saw examples of this, or would those kinds of people not even go to you to be interviewed? I'm wondering, you know, how can you capture people that, you know, who do have impairments but don't even accept that group? I don't need any accommodations, you know.
I think that's a really interesting, important point about the closet. It's dreadfully inadequate as a metaphor, and queer theorists in particular, I think, have rewritten and refigured the closet in many different useful ways. Tobin Siebers, for example, wrote in his wonderful article, Disability and Masquerade, that closeting indicates not things undisclosed, but also things difficult to disclose. And I wrote in Mad at School that maybe instead of a closet, we could use the image of a hall of mirrors for coming to a marginalized identity. Because at least to me, I've quote unquote come out as a number of different identities, including queer. And to me, it really doesn't feel like emerging from one space into a presumably larger space. It feels more like this weird progression through a series of reflections of self, all of which are confusing, and you don't totally know when you've sort of kind of staggered out into the carnival.
Essay about the mirror, too.
Ooh, I'm so glad it's over. What did you say?
Carolyn has a whole essay about relationships in the mirror as well.
In terms of the survey, we very specifically wanted to reach out to people who did not identify as disabled. And the introductory page of the survey says, you may define yourself as having mental health issues. You may define yourself as, and it sort of gave this list of different things. You do not have to identify as disabled. And a number of our participants made it very clear, especially in their open-ended responses, that disabled is not one of their identifications. For the interviews, I think we pretty much all have people who self-identify as disabled. We just, this particular study is not reaching that interesting liminal population that you're referring to. Even within this group of people who all identify as disabled, and many of whom sort of are quote-unquote officially disabled and like on the books and getting accommodations, I can't think of a single participant who hasn't had an interesting narrative around that identity and the ways that it is qualified and the ways that it is confusing, the ways that it gets taken up here but not taken up there, and the ways that they can claim it here but not there. So this is where also doing queer theory has been very useful to me, and to some degree critical race theory, although that's an area I'm not as familiar with, is there's just no such thing as really in or out, almost ever, unless you're filling out a form. But again, to go back to that liminal population, that would be a fascinating population to study, and I wonder how you would find them.
You almost have to go historical, because a lot of people kind of identify themselves as having had that identity in the past, but haven't sort of developmentally come to a different place. So
yeah, virtually everybody has a narrative about how they came to their disabled identity. Some people not. Some people have really been explicitly identified as disabled from a very early age or from birth. But I think most of the participants I'm thinking of that we've interviewed, we're a little bit over 20 interviews now, have some story about coming to that identity.
All right, so what we're going to do now is take a break. I don't know whether this space is being used for something else.